Okay, this video is about Margaret Atwood's novel Oryx and Crake, and in this I just want to take a topic and some details from the text and sort of steer you in a direction of how to think about writing an essay for this course based on the topic. So the topic will be environmentalism and natural resources, and looking at how the novel takes this up as an issue. And these are just sort of two more or less random, but obviously selected and important passages, but there's lots of them. These aren't the only two in the novel. So in my edition of the text, this is page 356 and page 220 of the novel. And so I'll just read the passages and offer some commentary on them. So Jimmy says, "I didn't know you were so altruistic," said Jimmy. "Since when had Crake been a cheerleader for the human race?" "It's not altruism exactly," said Crake. "More like sink or swim. I've seen the latest confidential corpse demographics reports. As a species, we're in deep trouble. Worse than anyone's saying. They're afraid to release the stats because people might just give up. But take it from me, we're running out of space-time. Demand for resources has exceeded supply for decades in marginal geopolitical areas, hence the famines and droughts. But very soon, demand is going to exceed supply for everyone. With the Bliss Plus pill, the human race will have a better chance of swimming." Okay? So this is partially Crake's motivation for doing what he's doing, is that he realizes that resources, natural resources of the planet, are being consumed. And this should obviously invoke, contemporary notions of resource depletion in the real world. How are we managing the world's resources? Okay? As a species, we're in deep trouble. Okay? And he says more like sink or swim. So notice that this idea of sink or swim is a kind of Darwinian notion, okay, of only the strong will survive. Okay? You've probably heard the phrase that's often attributed to Darwin. He didn't actually say this, but the phrase that's often attributed to him is survival of the fittest. Okay? And people use this to explain something like evolution. Okay? Now the problem with Darwinism is that it works fine in Darwin's theory of the evolution of species and the genetic mutations that happen over a fairly long period of time. That genetic mutations occur from generation to generation, and if a genetic mutation is helpful and it helps the species to adapt to their environment and thrive, then they will survive. If the mutation is detrimental, then they will die off. The thing that's important to understand about evolution in this sense is that genetic mutations are random. We don't control genetic mutation in the Darwinian natural selection sense. Genetic engineering is a different thing. Okay? The problem with Darwin is when we take that idea of Darwinism, of survival of the fittest, which in its original formulation means genetic fitness, okay, and we apply it to social things, not genetic things. Biology versus sociology, two different elements. And this is what we call social Darwinism. When people say survival of the fittest in the social realm, things that are not random mutations, but are in fact social policy, decisions over which we have some control, then we're talking about a whole different thing. Okay? So survival of the fittest works in genetic ways in one direction, and it works in very different ways in a social direction. Okay? And we want to be mindful of those things. So it would be like saying, well, people with physical disabilities, survival of the fittest, just let them die off. Okay? Well, why? Well, we can create wheelchairs or really fast wheelchairs or whatever for people with, say, physical disabilities. And we can create conditions where they can actually thrive and be productive and useful members of society. Okay? Where in a Darwinian sense, they might not be able to outrun the lion that's chasing them because they're physically disabled. But we have the social capacity to build wheelchairs. Okay, so you can see that the genetic and the social arguments are different, but people often confuse these things by saying, well, survival of the fittest, and they justify bad social policy through genetic arguments, but they're two different areas to be understood as different things. Okay, so you can see, I hope, the political problems with that. And so then he says, demand for resources has exceeded supply for decades in marginal geopolitical areas. So he's saying, yeah, we've been extracting resources across the planet, and demand has been, stripping resources from these places, far on the other side of the world. So like lithium from, Africa, or oil from the oil sands, and stuff. We're stripping the resources away, and there's been, but now it's becoming a kind of global issue. It used to be located in little places, where we found the mines or the resources or whatever, but now we're starting to realize that we're depleting everything, and so people are starting to get worried. And he's like, we're covering this up because, people will lose faith that we're kind of doomed. So depending on, what level of catastrophic thinking you engage in, we can see this as a fairly clear one-to-one relationship with the world. What is the state of the natural environment? Just take 2019, 2020 as an example, okay? Much of Australia burned to the ground at the beginning of this year. Right now, as I make this video, the west coast of the United States is on fire. We're getting the smoke in Alberta blocking out the sun. The Brazilian rainforest, as usual, is being burnt, but this year it's like even worse than it has in previous year, that every year seems to be more and more wildfires and environmental catastrophes of all sorts, climate change, storms in the Atlantic, hurricanes, and so forth, okay? You can say, well, this is, just a cyclical thing. People rationalize it in various ways, okay? But Atwood's asking us to think about this. Okay. The other passage I want to read for you, this is page 220, says, Uncle Pete sometimes watched too in the evenings when he was back from the golf course. He'd pour himself a drink, then provide a running commentary. The usual uproar, he said. They'll get tired of it. They'll settle down. Everybody wants a cheaper cup of coffee. You can't fight that. So this is an example. If you watch the mango videos, it mentions coffee plantations, it mentions jute plantations, and here we have coffee again. And he says, everybody wants a cheaper cup of coffee. You can't fight that. Hey, I'm drinking coffee again. Coffee's awesome. But what's the history of coffee? What is the environmental impact of coffee? So we run into our like of coffee against the environmental impact of drinking coffee, or using jute, or driving cars that require oil, or whatever, okay? Pick your resource. And so Crake's making the argument that resources are running out. But then Uncle Pete here is saying everybody wants a cheaper cup of coffee. You can't fight that. Well, how do we fight resource depletion? Do we just say, no coffee, nobody can ever have coffee? Or do we charge fair trade prices for coffee? Do we charge fair trade? What is the environmental cost, the resource extraction cost of coffee or anything? And so we run into the very difficult problem of human desires and wants and needs for coffee and food and so forth, okay, against the environmental costs. And these are political questions, right? And economic questions. Is coffee affordable? If coffee was $9 or $16 or $25 a cup, would you still drink it? Okay? And so the ability to have cheap coffee or cheap food or cheap flour or whatever the thing may be, how does that get paid for? And it gets paid for in various ways. And so Crake is saying, we've tipped the scales so far that we're running out of space-time. The world's going to be depleted of resources. So how do we tackle this environmental problem, this problem of resource depletion? And Uncle Pete's saying, everybody wants cheap coffee. You can't fight that. Well, at what point will we lose that battle because we're unwilling to fight for the environment because we'd rather have cheap coffee than environmental standards. So this is a long-standing, discussion around things, here in Alberta about the oil sands and the pollution that it causes and so forth. People say about the economy and blah, blah. And people talk about this all the time, right? So here Atwood's just taking up this issue. And so your task as a student in this course, if you wanted to write on a topic like this, would be to, go to the details like this and say, how does Atwood in the novel play this out? Because clearly we have dialogues between Jimmy and Crake about these things, okay? And they argue, okay, different positions. And so it's up to us as readers, as thinkers, and as writers to pick out the details and try and understand Atwood's argument that she's making in the novel about these questions of resources.